is an associate editor of the journal Psychoanalytic Dialogues and an adjunct clinical associate professor in the postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis at NYU, New York University. Go ahead, Jay. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Kit. I'm going to start by asking the question who Trump's supporters are, and obviously we have some data about that. Support for Trump correlates with white ethnocentrism, racial resentment towards immigrants, with opposition and rejection of a value shift in American society, which has been taking place at least since the 1960s. Revolution in sexual behavior, gender roles, greater freedom there, greater tolerance of personal autonomy, personal expressiveness, differences between people, and the turning away from traditional sources of authority, notably the church and the state. And the Republican Party can be seen as really in counter-revolution against these changes. Trump's support also, to some degree, correlates with lower educational levels. So what is the common denominator here? To a certain extent, support for Trump, I should say in the last week or so, it's been changing because people who had opposed Trump up to this point, he's becoming mainstream within the Republican Party now. But up until then, people who were essentially dispossessed, left behind, displaced, unsupported by a changing society, felt left out economically in terms of racial and demographic changes, in terms of changes in values. And from we can also talk about neoliberal capitalism, I'm sure that will come up again and again today, as also creating a sense of anxiety, insecurity, and dispossession. From a psychoanalytic perspective, Esther Shalgo has written a very interesting book called Psychoanalytic Reflections on Politics, and she talks about kind of societies providing a mother function and a father function, and the mother function is really Winnicott's sense of holding, meaning providing people a sense that they have a valued place in society, that who they are is valued, that their contributions are valued. And the father function from Lacan, the name of the father, or the law of the father, that opposes people taking refuge in fantasy solutions, in imaginary solutions, and needing to face realities that must be dealt with, losses, difficulties, and so on. And so if we're dealing with a phenomenon that is basically a reaction to the sense of being dispossessed by one's society, not cared for by one's society, how do dispossessed people react? Well, I'm gonna go to Ferencz's theory of trauma. Ferenczi was first generation after Freud psychoanalyst, and in the late 20s and early 30s he developed a theory of trauma which is based upon the idea of identification with the aggressor. Very relevant here. And the basis of it is that children more than anything need to feel that they belong. And it's traumatic to feel excluded and emotionally abandoned. And what children do when they feel this is they comply, they try to fit in, they try to be good. His theory of trauma really involved two phases. And the first phase was the actual assault. And Ferenczi felt that children could get through pretty much any kind of assault if there was somebody to provide support and understanding. But what happens very often when children are abused within their families is they seek comfort and they seek help, and they're told, what are you talking about? It didn't happen. It didn't happen like that. You're making up stories. You wanted it. You deserved it, and so on. And Ferenczi called this appropriately hypocrisy. And hypocrisy gives the child the sense that they are completely abandoned within the family at their moment of greatest need. And the reaction at that point is to give up any semblance of protecting oneself and to comply in behavior with what's expected, to be the best victim that you can, to comply mentally in terms of feeling and thinking and perceiving and understanding things the way you're supposed to, and not according to your personal experience. And very importantly here, critical thinking has to be given up, because critical thinking involves the potential of separating. And the thing that's most important is to belong. And finally, children take upon themselves the blame for what's happened to them. I think shame is a very important part of the feeling shame for what somebody else has done to you is a very important part of the reaction to trauma. And importantly, it's not just child abuse that evokes this reaction. Very subtle traumas can also, any situation which really threatens social exclusion tends to evoke this. We comply so that we belong. I don't know if you know the Stanford prison experiment done by Zimbardo, but that's a good example of people complying even against their own character with the social roles that are expected in order to fit in. And people obviously comply even when their own actual interests are disregarded. So I just want to note Bion here, the great British psychoanalyst, who said when the mother can't, when the child expresses a proto-thought and the mother can tolerate it, bear it, metabolize it, and then the child can start to think it. But when the mother doesn't do this, he said, omniscience becomes a substitute for learning from experience by the aid of thoughts and thinking, and substitutes for the discrimination between true and false, a dictatorial affirmation that one thing is morally right and the other is morally wrong. And on a larger scale, going back to the parental functions that a society needs to provide, when a society doesn't accept somebody for who they are, doesn't value them, this becomes the response. And so in American society, which is so enamored with neoliberal values of hyper-personal responsibility, we have a society, as Donald Trump would say, a society of losers, people who are really not doing so well, and for whom society says it's really your fault. Society doesn't owe you anything. And so people's reaction to trauma is not just to identify and comply, but to compensate for this with omnipotent fantasy. And that involves paranoid hatred, a sense of manic superiority towards scapegoats, an aggressive sense of manic excitement. And these fantasies, which in a certain sense are designed to provide us a sense of specialness and a sense of belonging, not just being an ordinary accepted member of society, but being a member of a special group. Despite the rhetoric of standing up for oneself, they actually facilitate compliance because you have to comply in order to partake of the fantasy. So these narcissistic compensations offer an exciting, omnipotent, pressurized cover story that denies people's losses and difficulties, and tells them that they're not losers, they're winners. So where does Trump fit in here? Well, in the concept developed by Sheldon Bach, Trump is an overinflated narcissist who appears to have none of the insecurities that his followers are so aware of within themselves, and are desperately trying to escape. In Lacanian terms, he's the mirror that they look into and see the perfect baby that they long to be. And certainly his aggressiveness and his, screw you attitude are mistaken for the lack of any insecurity, the lack of anxiety. Nothing constrains me, nothing binds me. I do what I want, which is so appealing to people who feel very powerless. One aspect of Trump as a person, well, a couple of aspects, is that number one, he seems to have no self-questioning, no self-doubt, no self-reflection. What a relief. Second, he seems shameless. He doesn't seem shameless, he is shameless. And that's really
very confused.
Thank you, John. And he doesn't seem capable of shame, and he should be ashamed of himself. And his refusal to feel shame is kind of a guide to people, and it says, you feel shame, you feel bad about yourself, screw that. Be like me, just, and not only, he takes the rejection of reality to the point of having a contemptuous relationship with truth, with facts. He changes, and people love this. It's people don't say, oh, well, you said something different the other day. They don't care because they don't want to be bound by facts either. And that's so appealing to people who feel so constrained and so hemmed in. So in a certain way, his followers have a lot of shame that they need to escape. Shame because they are the losers. As Trump keeps reminding, Trump doesn't call them the losers, but he keeps using that word, and who do they think he's referring to?